So what about when guilt is certain and punishment needs to happen?
Romemu, Romemu, Adonai Eloheinu, Romemu.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and thank you for joining me as we stir up a little Torah together. Yeah, my first experience personally of epistemological certainty when it came to someone else's guilt, I won't go into much detail, but it was a long time ago. I was in a storage room rummaging through some papers, and there was a concert coming up, and I was relying on someone. This person had agreed to do what they said they were going to do, and as I was rummaging through those papers, I heard this person talking with two of their friends saying, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and wait until last minute to tell Paul that I'm not going to, well, that he wasn't going to do what he said he was going to do. So yeah, that's called epistemological certainty. We know what we know, and we know that we can know that. And normally on this channel and normally in my rabbinate, I spend a lot more time on the reality of not being certain. That if I'm going to be talking about someone's guilt, if I'm going to be talking about judging someone, that what I really want to talk about is exactly what the sages spent so many pages of the Talmud discussing, hundreds and hundreds of years, hundreds of discussions saying, how can we know? How can we know that we have no doubt? How can we find ourselves in a place where that is certain? And the sages were wise enough, probably why we call them sages in many cases, to say we can't know. But nonetheless, regardless of that, there are times in law, and certainly in Jewish legal history, where we have to, for a moment, dispense with that uncertainty and say, yes, but in the situation that we know, what do we do? So as unpleasant as it is for me to dispense with what I find so important, that we should look in the mirror with humility and question ourselves, I am going to spend today meditating a little bit on the concept of certainty and guilt and punishment. What does the Torah say, and what does that imply? Now, we're in Parashat Teitzei, getting towards the end of Deuteronomy right now. High holidays are coming very, very near. And Teitzei is filled with legal questions, moral and ethical problems. And the three verses I'm going to read are difficult and problematic and, quite frankly, very unpleasant, as any time we are dealing with guilt and punishment, it should be a little unpleasant. We read in chapter 25 of Deuteronomy, verses 1, 2, and 3, when there is a dispute between men and they go to law, and a decision is rendered declaring the one in the right and the other in the wrong, if the guilty one is to be flogged, the magistrate shall have him lie down and be given lashes in his presence, by count, as his guilt warrants. He may be given up to 40 lashes, but not more, lest being flogged further to excess, your brother be degraded before your eyes. So when you start going through what the sages say about this, there's a lot of parsing the words to make sure that people understand what's being spoken about. And as we read this, we see, well, a magistrate has made a decision between two people. The question starts poking out really quickly on, okay, wait a second, a judge has made a decision, how can we be sure? And to some extent, we have to dispense with that because the language here is unambiguous regarding there being guilt. So we just have to assume that we've gotten to that point because, for example, and Ibn Ezra talks about this and several other commentators. So the part of this that I translated as, if the guilty one is to be flogged, the Hebrew is im bin hakot rasha. So if, and then bin is pointed out by Ibn Ezra to mean is worthy of, hakot is to be smote, right? Good old biblical word. So if one is worthy of being flogged, and then harasha, the guilty one or the evil one, this is unambiguous language. This is someone who, let's assume it's as clear as me hearing the voice of the person who has done the dastardly deed. And there is some surface stuff talked about by commentators that is absolutely worth throwing into this mix, because when we know someone's guilty, I'm not talking think we know, I'm talking we got the email, I'm talking we heard the conversation, not someone told us about it, not we're pretty darn sure, but we know. Well, when we know that we know that we know, it starts bubbling up pretty quickly. We want to get that revenge, and right off the bat, we've got a limit. It's interesting, we were supposed to give 40 or up to 40 lashes. 40 is a typological number in Judaism. It means a lot. We are to give a lot, but up to, and in the Talmud, the sages say 39 lashes are to be given. So never that a lot, always one less. There's a principle of mercy there, but there's even more, because we have the words lo yosif, not more. And that is the first nice little red flag to hold up as we recognize the emotions inside of us when we know someone is guilty, when we know someone is deserving of some sort of punishment, that when we know someone's deserving of some punishment, it is our tendency as human beings to then not know when to stop. And so even in the event of someone's guilt, there is a line to be drawn. It's a good first lesson to be learned from this, especially if we ourselves are in the middle of that meditation of how far can we take someone's punishment. The second one is a little bit more subtle and a little bit less talked about in our sources, but it is the requirement for the magistrate to lie the person who is to be punished down. And people like Rashi comment that this is the correct position, but there's not a whole lot of why this is the correct position. And the answer is really, really unpleasant. If you look at Roman flogging techniques, for example, the idea is, and I'm sorry this is unpleasant, to have the hands tied up above you or back behind you in a way that you are essentially being crushed and asphyxiated while you are as well being lashed. And so as subtle as it is, and as much as it doesn't feel like it pertains to today, because we'd like to think we have no cruel and unusual punishment. Oh, that's right, it's 2022, I guess we still do. But we'd like to have the illusion that we've gone beyond flogging people, says the person born in the country that is once again talking about corporal punishment all over in the United States. So maybe I can just leave this apology slot, realize that this is exactly where we are, so we should be discussing this literally and not metaphorically. But this principle is, if this is the appropriate punishment, and I'm not having this argument, but if this is the appropriate punishment, we don't add on to it by creating more distress in the body. The punishment of flogging is punishment enough. We're not going to go for asphyxiation while we're at it. Thank you. There's a third part here that I want to really focus on, and it's subtle, but still very clearly in the text, and not many people talk about it. And it's the idea that the person who has rendered judgment, the shofet, that's where we get the word shoftim. The book of Judges is the book of shoftim in Hebrew. If you watch a basketball game in Israel, the refs are called shoftim. It's kind of fun to see biblical language pop up in basketball. But the person who renders the judgment, who has decided this person's right, this person's wrong, the wrong person is rasha, is guilty, and is definitely guilty, we're going to go ahead and punish them. Well, the judge is the one who's responsible to make sure the punishment goes correctly, to make sure that the person being punished is in the right position, and then also that they are to make sure that the correct amount of lashes is meted out, meaning not more than 40. The sages of the Talmud also say that they're the appropriate strength of lashes for the crime. So someone who's doing the punishment who's had a bad day doesn't get to take it out on the person no matter how guilty they are. But even that is less important than this larger issue. Than the person who is responsible for making judgment has to be present as the punishment is carried out. And that's where I want to close this. So there are two places I think we can go with this in order to take a really hard look in the mirror. The first one is obvious but really difficult. The second one is less obvious but maybe a little bit more easy to carry forward. And the first one is the unpleasant conversation of cancellation. Because yes, like it or not, there are people who have done and said absolutely horrific things. And the reason this may be obvious but is really difficult to talk about, because if someone is involved in constant cancellation, most likely they're not really worried about epistemology when it comes to guilt. They're not really worried about how do I know that this is true? How do I know that this guilt is what I think it is and it's warranted? The sad thing about cancellation, whether it comes from one side or the other, is the epistemological certainty. The certainty that I know what I know doesn't come from facts, it comes from ideology. And the problem with this kind of cancellation is it automatically steps aside from any ethical considerations. What do I mean by that? The ethical consideration is the universalization of how we treat other people. In other words, if we participate ideologically in cancellation, then we are participating in something that we would not have done to ourselves. So therefore, we are doing something reprehensible to someone else, even if they deserve it, that even if we were to make a mistake and we deserve it, we would not want anyone to do to us. So I'm not talking about the ideological situations. If someone's ideologically going to cancel someone who is on the other side of the political spectrum, there's nothing I can say that's going to change that. What I'm talking about is those of us who might get caught up in the moment, right? In the studies of mob behavior, if you've got 100 angry people outside of a store window, no one's going to throw that stone, no matter how angry they are, until that one person who will throw the stone throws the stone. Once one person has done it, then two more people will. Once two people have done it, it starts exploding out pretty quickly. Well, it's the same sort of thing when it comes to arbitrary cancellation due to ideology, not because we are absolutely certain of someone's guilt in a real, tangible, and objective sense, but because someone has done something on the opposite side of our ideology. If we are engaged in that, then we're probably still not going to try to destroy someone's life, but as soon as someone else begins to destroy their life, then we pile on. And if you have a social media account like I do, you've probably been engaged in a pile-on at some point, even if we were not the ones who originally threw that stone through the window. And so just carrying that analogy forward for a second, taking this verse from Teitzei and keeping that in mind, let's say we are the 17th person who's piled on, who's thrown the stone. We have placed ourselves in a position of being the shofet, of being the judge in this situation, and our responsibility is multifold in this situation, to make sure that the punishment is limited to its extent, to make sure that it is not more harsh than is allowed by whichever law we're following, and that we are present for the entire punishment of that real human person, and that we are part of the responsibility to make sure, on the one hand, that the punishment is carried out, on the other hand, that the punishment stops when the punishment is to be stopped. In other words, even punishment in Judaism is dialogic. It's not just about the person being punished. It's about us taking ethical responsibility upon ourselves to not punish someone in a way that we, if we had to look in the mirror and force ourselves to admit we did the worst possible thing, still a punishment that we would not accept for ourselves. Even if we say, I am worthy of lashes, that the administration of those lashes, we could say, I deserve that, but it was still fair. And that's why this verse is so powerful, because it is the idea of being present, which removes from us so many of the punishments that we try to mete out today. Back to my old question on which of us wish to be judged by the most daft 200-some characters we have ever uttered in our lives. Again, if you're locked in ideology, then you know that, because right now you're thinking, I've never uttered anything that's worthy of cancellation. It's the month of Elul. We're about to hit Rosh Hashanah after that Yom Kippur. We have all uttered something that is worthy of cancellation. We are all flawed humans. We have all harmed someone. And this idea that gets us past how we are behaving now into a society that is not in the process of tearing itself apart is by following this pattern of behavior. If I see someone uttering really, and remember, this is a guilty person. This is Harasha, who is deserving bin makot. So we see someone actually saying the horrible thing where they absolutely do deserve punishment. Then what we are required to do is be present in that. We are not then able to send off an anonymous email to an employer and then wash our hands of the stone that we have just thrown and go and have a nice merlot. Our requirement, if we are acting as judge, is to accept the full responsibility of being judge, which is to be present, to make sure the punishment happens, but lo yosif, it does not go more. Which brings us to the less obvious but maybe easier to deal with, and that is our moments of true epistemological certainty when it comes to someone's guilt. How is that going to happen today? I'm not talking about the criminal justice system at this point. If in the criminal justice system, well, in every country, but my home country, the United States, if we had epistemological certainty through our legal process, we would not require groups like the Innocence Project. I'm talking about where we act as a judge. Unless we actually are a judge, then this is a different conversation. But when we act as a judge, when we are the one who is able to judge that guilt, is probably that version of we're in the storeroom and we hear someone's voice. More likely today, someone has copied us incorrectly on the email, and having both sent emails I shouldn't have and received ones that I was not meant to. This can, sadly, get pretty bad pretty quickly. Mostly because this isn't someone who we have caught saying a really bad thing on Twitter. This is someone who has directed their actions at us. And then the very subtle and maybe obvious answer that comes out of this is, are we the ones in that moment that are in a position to be the judge, to be the shofet? Which brings us back to the truth of the very beginning of this verse. If you and another person go in front of a magistrate and the magistrate determines who's right and wrong, if we're the one who's in the dispute, we can't be the judge, which is maybe the most terrifyingly interesting part of this entire discussion. The one time where we absolutely know the guilt of the other person is perhaps the one time where we are unable to actually act in judgment of them, which is why, as imperfect as our various different legal systems are, they are required for us to be able to exist with each other. And so the final meditation that comes out of this is awareness of how often in society as it's made up today, we place ourselves in the position of judge when either, on the one hand, we have no way of knowing whether guilt objectively exists, or we have absolute certainty that guilt exists, and therefore we should not be the ones judging in the first place. What this really points to is a system that cannot exist in the polarization that exists today, where communities of people gather together and recognize that when it comes to our disputes, there's a job to do. And the judgment of those disputes is not based on who is ideologically right and wrong, but the ability to dispassionately get the best information possible and then to make sure that the correct procedures, the correct compassion, but also justice happens. And in order to have all these things, what we're talking about is functional civil societies, with a huge focus on the word civil. And the question that opens to us as we get really close now to the High Holy Days is, are we involved in a civil society, or are we involved right now in making society as uncivilized as possible through our anger, through our righteous wrath, through our attempt to tear down that which we through our ideologies believe to be awful, but would of course react horribly were the same things aimed in our direction? Are we a part of making sure that as much as we as humans have failed in every culture, in every religion, in every people, in every country, throughout all of history, to have equal justice for all people in all situations, that the only way to even attempt to bring that about is to focus on the ideal of equal justice for all people in all situations. And that means being very aware of our part in that process. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Romemu Adonai